You're camping under a star-filled sky when a piercing beam of light suddenly floods your campsite, immobilizing you in a grip of sheer terror. The world around you falls silent, and you feel an icy chill creep into your bones. You can't look away as the light engulfs you, and a chilling thought creeps into your mind. What if you're not alone, and something from beyond the stars has come to claim you? Chapter 1. The French Farmer and the Saucer, France. It was a quiet, cool September evening in 1954 when Marius de Wilde's life changed forever. The small, rural village of Corable, nestled in northern France, was the kind of place where time felt as if it stood still. Neighbors knew each other well, and the countryside was a place of peace and predictability. But on that night, as Marius was tending to his usual farm chores, the familiar tranquility of his world was about to be shattered by something unimaginable. Marius was no stranger to late-night tasks, often attending to his animals or fixing equipment by the fading light. Around 10 p.m., he noticed his dog barking furiously, an unusual event for the normally calm animal. Puzzled, he stepped outside his cottage, the cold air brushing his skin, to see what had agitated the dog so much. His eyes scanned the horizon. His farmhouse and the surrounding fields were bathed in eerie moonlight. Then he saw it, a strange glow emanating from the nearby railway tracks, a few hundred meters from his home. His first thought was that a train had broken down, or perhaps workers were repairing something. But as he approached the tracks, the intensity of the light became unnatural, almost blinding. Marius, now fully alert and deeply unsettled, could make out the silhouette of a strange object, a metallic, cigar-shaped craft sitting on the tracks. It wasn't a train. His heart raced. This was something else, something far beyond his understanding. The air seemed heavier, charged with an unseen energy. Then, to his horror, he saw them, two small, humanoid figures emerging from the shadows of the craft. They stood no taller than a child, but moved with unnerving precision and coordination. Their heads were oversized, their features indistinct in the dim light. Marius was paralyzed with fear, his breath caught in his throat. He had never believed in anything supernatural or extraterrestrial. But there they were, right in front of him. As Marius stood frozen, the beings seemed to acknowledge his presence. Without warning, the craft emitted a sudden beam of intense light. It hit him squarely, as if an invisible force had seized his body. His muscles locked, and his limbs refused to obey him. Marius later described it as being paralyzed, like a statue. The air around him felt electrically charged, a humming sensation running through his bones. He tried to scream, but his voice betrayed him. His mind raced, he wasn't dreaming, and this was no hallucination. The figures seemed to study him for a brief moment, their inscrutable eyes catching the moonlight before they swiftly turned and re-entered the craft. The machine itself emitted a strange, low hum, like a distant engine but somehow organic, as though it was alive. Then, without warning, the craft lifted off the tracks with a smooth, effortless motion, hovering above the ground for a moment before shooting into the sky at an impossible speed. Within seconds, it was gone, leaving Marius standing alone in the cold, silent night. In the aftermath of the encounter, Marius struggled to comprehend what had just happened. His body ached, his head throbbed with a splitting pain, and his skin felt burned, as though he had been too close to a roaring fire. Disoriented and terrified, he stumbled back to his house, trying to make sense of the unexplainable. The next morning, the evidence was undeniable. At the site of the encounter, the ground around the railway tracks was charred and scorched. Marius found strange, metallic impressions in the dirt, tracks unlike anything he had ever seen. Word of the sighting spread quickly through the village, and soon, the authorities were involved. The French police conducted an investigation, but their findings only deepened the mystery. The strange indentations were analyzed and found to be consistent with something incredibly heavy pressing into the ground, but there was no logical explanation for what could have caused them. Radiation levels were reported to be unusually high near the site, adding an unsettling dimension to the encounter. The villagers were split in their reactions. Some believed Marius had seen something out of this world, while others dismissed him as a man who had perhaps spent too many nights alone in the fields. But the physical evidence could not be ignored. Marius's health began to decline rapidly in the days following the incident. He was plagued by severe headaches, nausea, and unexplained skin rashes. His once robust constitution seemed to wither under the weight of the experience. Doctors could find no clear cause for his ailments, leaving Marius to wonder if his close encounter with the unknown had fundamentally altered him. As weeks turned into months, Marius's psychological state deteriorated as well. He became obsessed with UFOs, spending hours poring over books and newspapers, searching for answers for anyone who might believe him. His nights were filled with vivid, recurring nightmares of the beings he had seen, silent figures watching him from the shadows, always just out of reach. His once simple, quiet life had been overtaken by the shadow of that night. Despite the profound impact on Marius's health and psyche, the official narrative remained evasive. Local authorities chalked it up to misinterpretation, perhaps an atmospheric anomaly or hallucination, though they offered no explanation for the physical traces left behind. Marius, however, remained convinced of what he had seen and experienced. He was not alone. In the years following his encounter, similar reports began surfacing across France and Europe. Other farmers, rural workers, and ordinary citizens recounted eerie tales of unidentified objects in the sky, strange beings, and physical traces left behind. The rural landscape of northern France became an epicenter for UFO sightings. For Marius de Wilde, the encounter in Corbel was a turning point, not just for his personal life, but for the growing field of UFO research in Europe. His story became one of the most well-documented cases in French UFO history, capturing the attention of investigators and enthusiasts worldwide. But for Marius, the fame and notoriety were of little comfort. He had glimpsed something beyond human comprehension, something that had forever marked him, physically and mentally. To this day, the incident remains unsolved. The ground around the railway tracks eventually healed, and the physical scars on Marius faded with time. But the psychological wounds lingered, and the mystery of that night in 1954 continues to haunt the quiet countryside of Corbel, a reminder of the unknown forces that sometimes cross into our world, leaving nothing behind but questions, fear, and a scarred witness. Chapter 2. The Westall School Encounter, Australia. April 6, 1966, was a day that would forever haunt the memories of the students and staff of Westall High School in Melbourne, Australia. It began as an ordinary school day, the early autumn air crisp and filled with the usual sounds of children at play, teachers preparing for their classes, and the rustling of leaves on the wind. But by mid-morning, the serenity of that suburban school would be shattered by something no one there would ever forget. At approximately 11 a.m., students and teachers were outside, enjoying their morning recess, when an unusual commotion began to ripple through the playground. Some of the children had noticed something in the sky, something that shouldn't have been there. Pointing and shouting, a small group gathered on the grassy oval field behind the school. As more students turned their gaze upwards, the spectacle became undeniable. Suspended above them was a metallic, saucer-like craft, silently hovering just above the treetops of a nearby pine grove. The craft appeared to be smooth, silvery, and about the size of 2 or 3 cars. Its motionless position in the air was unnerving, as if defying gravity itself. For a few moments, it just floated there, eerily silent, a stark contrast to the increasingly frantic voices of those below. Teachers soon joined the students, equally stunned by what they were seeing. It was unlike anything anyone had ever seen, certainly not an airplane or a weather balloon. Suddenly, without warning, the object moved. It descended quickly toward an open field adjacent to the school grounds, disappearing behind the trees. Excitement turned to fear as some of the braver students ran toward the grove to get a closer look, desperate to uncover what this bizarre object might be. Others stayed back, too frightened or confused to move. In those brief moments, as the craft neared the ground, an overwhelming sense of dread began to fill the air. The students who made it to the edge of the field later described seeing the craft land, or at least hover very close to the ground, though no one could explain how. It remained in place for several minutes. Those who dared to come closer could feel the static-like charge in the air, a faint hum that seemed to vibrate through the ground. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the craft shot back up into the sky, this time with incredible speed. It ascended at an impossible angle and vanished from sight in a matter of seconds. The whole event had lasted no more than 20 minutes, but its impact would last a lifetime for those who witnessed it. Over 200 people, students, teachers, and even a few passersby had seen something that day. Something unexplainable. Almost immediately after the event, a strange sense of suppression began to settle over the school. Before anyone could fully comprehend what they had just witnessed, men in dark suits arrived. These were no ordinary authorities. They moved quickly, instructing the teachers to gather the students inside and tell them to forget what they had seen. The air seemed to thicken with tension. The students were warned not to talk about it, especially not to the press. Some of the teachers were taken aside for private conversations, and soon after, the headmaster addressed the entire school, telling them to stop speaking about the event entirely. For the students, the fear and confusion were palpable. They had just witnessed something extraordinary, yet they were being told to act as if nothing had happened. Some were taken out of class and questioned by these unidentified men, who were both intimidating and persuasive. For many of the students, this suppression added another layer of terror to an already frightening encounter. The feeling of being silenced, of knowing they had seen something beyond explanation, yet being told to pretend otherwise, weighed heavily on them. It was as if they had stumbled upon a secret that the world wasn't ready to face, a secret that those in power were determined to keep buried. In the days and weeks that followed, rumors spread through the town, and news of the incident leaked to the public. However, any attempts to investigate were met with stonewalling. Local newspapers reported the sighting, but official responses were frustratingly vague. The Australian military dismissed it as nothing more than a weather balloon or a misidentified plane. But the witnesses knew better. What they had seen defied any conventional explanation. For some of the students, the experience became a defining moment in their lives. A few became deeply interested in the UFO phenomenon, dedicating years to trying to uncover the truth about what had happened that day. They scoured books, contacted researchers, and even gave interviews decades later, still convinced that what they had seen was extraterrestrial in nature. For others, the encounter left lasting psychological scars. Some students reported feeling haunted by the memory, plagued by a sense of dread whenever they recalled the strange craft and the shadowy men who followed. Then there were those who faced ridicule. Speaking out about the incident often led to mockery from peers and even adults. Several students found themselves ostracized by their communities, their credibility questioned at every turn. For years, the event was a source of controversy and debate, dividing families and friends. The students who remained silent often did so out of fear, not wanting to face the consequences of telling their story. But silence didn't erase the memories. The image of that craft, the eerie quiet before it moved, and the overwhelming feeling of being watched, these sensations lingered like ghosts, impossible to shake. As time passed, the Westall UFO encounter took on an almost mythic status within Australian culture. It became one of the most famous mass UFO sightings in history, sparking intense debates between skeptics, believers, and conspiracy theorists. The Australian government's reluctance to provide any clear answers only fueled suspicion. Was it an experimental aircraft? A foreign spy plane? Or was it, as many of the witnesses believed, something from beyond our world? Despite the decades that have passed since that April morning, the Westall incident remains unsolved. Investigations by UFO researchers have uncovered no concrete answers, and official government documents pertaining to the case remain elusive or classified. Those who witnessed the event continue to stand by their accounts, even as the skepticism surrounding their claims endures. For them, the truth of what they saw on that day in 1966 is unshakable, a terrifying encounter that has left an indelible mark on their lives. Chapter 3: The Cash-Landrum Incident, USA. On the cold night of December 29th, 1980, 3 lives would be forever altered on a quiet road in rural Texas. Betty Cash, Vicki Landrum, and Vicki's young grandson, Colby, were driving home from a dinner out when they encountered something so horrifying, so otherworldly, that the experience would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The trio was heading down Highway FM 1485, surrounded by thick pine trees and the desolate quiet of the Texas countryside. It was around 9 p.m., and the road was dark, save for the car's headlights cutting through the inky blackness. Conversation in the car was light, until something in the sky caught their attention. At first, it appeared as a bright light in the distance, but as they drove closer, it became clear that this was no ordinary star or aircraft. The object was hovering low over the road, a massive, diamond-shaped craft emitting a blinding light and intense heat. As they approached, the air grew thick and oppressive, and Vicki, who was deeply religious, began to panic. She believed they were witnessing a sign from God, perhaps even the end of days. "Stop the car," she screamed. Betty, who was driving, pulled over to the side of the road, trying to make sense of what they were seeing. The craft hovered, almost blocking the entire road ahead, its metallic surface reflecting the orange and red glow of the light it emitted. It was massive, easily the size of a small building, and it radiated an intense heat that felt unnatural, like standing too close to a roaring fire. The craft moved slowly, pulsating with an eerie hum that reverberated in their bones. Vicki, terrified but convinced this was a divine encounter, stepped out of the car with young Colby in tow. She stood on the side of the road, staring up at the craft, her body bathed in the oppressive heat. Betty, more cautious, remained in the car, but even there the heat was unbearable. The car's metal exterior grew so hot that when Betty finally decided to step outside, she burned her hand on the door handle. The trio stood there, mesmerized and horrified by the craft. Betty, ever the pragmatic one, tried to make sense of what she was seeing. It looked nothing like a plane or helicopter. Its diamond shape, the intense heat, and the way it hovered defied all logic. She could see flames shooting out from the bottom, as if it were struggling to remain in the air. Then, just when it seemed as though the craft might land, it began to rise slowly, its ascent marked by a strange rumble that vibrated through the ground beneath their feet. As the craft rose, something even stranger happened. Military helicopters, at least 20 of them, swarmed the sky around it. The sudden appearance of so many helicopters was jarring. They seemed to be escorting the craft, following it as it drifted away into the night sky. The craft and the helicopters eventually disappeared from view, leaving only the echo of their presence and an eerie silence in the air. Shaken and confused, Betty, Vicki, and Colby climbed back into the car. Their bodies ached, their skin felt tight and blistered, as though they had spent hours under the scorching sun. They were too rattled to speak much on the drive home, but what they didn't realize was that the nightmare had only just begun. Within hours, all three began to feel the effects of their exposure to the craft. Betty, who had been closest to it, suffered the worst. She developed severe headaches, nausea, and a burning sensation all over her body. Her eyes swelled shut, and her skin turned red and blistered, much like the effects of severe sunburn. Vicki and Colby also experienced similar symptoms, though to a lesser degree. Their skin blistered and peeled, and they were overcome by a constant, debilitating weakness. The days that followed were a blur of hospital visits and worsening symptoms. Betty's condition deteriorated rapidly. She lost large patches of skin, her hair fell out in clumps, and she was plagued by recurring infections. The doctors were baffled. Her symptoms resembled those of severe radiation exposure, but no one could explain how she could have been exposed to such high levels of radiation in rural Texas. Vicki, while not as severely affected, also suffered from recurring skin rashes, hair loss, and debilitating fatigue. Colby, though the youngest and seemingly more resilient, also bore the scars of that night, both physically and psychologically. As the weeks turned into months, Betty's health continued to spiral downward. Her once strong body had been ravaged by the encounter, and she was forced to spend most of her time in and out of hospitals. Despite numerous medical tests, no definitive cause for her ailments was ever found. The physical and psychological toll of that night weighed heavily on all three witnesses. Vicky, who had been the most vocal about the encounter, found herself ostracized by her community. Friends and neighbors avoided her, dismissing her claims as the ravings of a woman who had lost her grip on reality. Even the authorities seemed to brush off their story, offering no explanation for what had happened or why military helicopters had been involved. The Cash-Landrum incident, as it came to be known, would go on to become one of the most infamous UFO cases in American history, not just for the sighting itself, but for the horrifying aftermath. Betty Cash never fully recovered from her injuries and died in 1998, her death attributed to complications from the encounter. Vicky and Colby, though they survived, were left with lifelong health problems, their bodies marked by that brief encounter on a dark Texas road. In the years that followed, the incident became a flashpoint in the UFO community. The presence of military helicopters led many to believe that the craft was some kind of experimental aircraft, perhaps nuclear-powered, whose exposure to civilians had been a tragic accident. Others insisted that the craft was of extraterrestrial origin, and that the military had been tasked with covering up the incident. Lawsuits were filed against the U.S. government, seeking compensation for the medical bills and suffering endured by the witnesses, but these were dismissed, with the government denying any involvement. The Cash-Landrum incident remains a terrifying, unsolved mystery. The encounter left scars not only on the bodies of the witnesses, but also on the collective psyche of those who study UFO phenomena. It stands as one of the clearest cases linking a UFO sighting to severe, lasting physical harm, raising disturbing questions about what exactly they encountered that night, and why the government seemed so keen on keeping it hidden. Chapter 4. The Voronezh Landing, Russia. On the evening of September 27, 1989, in the Russian city of Voronezh, a terrifying and bizarre incident would unfold that would rattle the collective psyche of the community. It was a late autumn day, the kind where the sky turns quickly to dusk, and children filled the local park, playing soccer, riding bikes, and running through the leaves. It should have been a day like any other, but what happened next would turn an ordinary playground into the site of one of the most perplexing UFO encounters in history. Just after 6 p.m., the first sighting came. A group of boys playing soccer was interrupted by a strange object in the sky. At first, they thought it might be a balloon or some sort of aircraft, but as it drew closer, their confusion turned to fear. The object was massive, around 10 meters in diameter, and shaped like a disc with bright, pulsating lights around its edge. As it hovered in the air, the children stood frozen, staring in awe as the craft descended from the sky. Without warning, the craft landed in a nearby park, not far from where the children were playing. Its landing was silent, with no sound of engines or mechanical movement. A few adults who had been nearby also stopped and stared in disbelief. Some ran for cover, unable to comprehend what was happening, while others, paralyzed by fear or sheer curiosity, stayed rooted to the spot. The air seemed to change, thickening with an unnatural presence, as though the entire world had momentarily shifted. Then, as if the sight of the craft wasn't enough, something even more chilling occurred. The hatch of the craft opened slowly, and from within, 3 beings emerged. They were not human, that much was clear. The beings were described as towering humanoid figures, standing nearly 10 feet tall, with elongated limbs and strange, bulbous heads. Their movements were slow and deliberate, almost mechanical in their precision. Their skin, or what appeared to be some form of covering, was grayish, with a texture unlike anything the witnesses had ever seen before. Alongside the humanoid figures was a smaller, robotic-like being, which moved in a stilted, jerking manner, as if controlled by an unseen force. It was square-shaped, its body gleaming metallic under the dim light, and it followed the humanoids closely. The witnesses, both children and adults, watched in silent horror as the beings began to move about the park. The robotic figure appeared to be scanning the area, its head swiveling in unnatural motions, while the larger beings seemed to be communicating with each other in ways no one could understand. The fear in the children's eyes was palpable. One of the boys, Dmitri, later described how his body felt paralyzed with terror, as though some unseen force held him in place. Another child, Sasha, recalled how the beings looked straight at him, and in that moment, he felt as if his very thoughts were being read. Panic began to spread among the group, but no one knew what to do. Running seemed impossible. The sheer shock of the encounter kept most of them rooted to the ground. One witness, a local adult named Boris, tried to make sense of the scene unfolding before him. He later said that the being's appearance was so far removed from anything he could have imagined that it seemed like a nightmare brought to life. He had always been a skeptic when it came to UFOs, dismissing them as nonsense, but there was no denying what he saw that night in Voronezh. He and others could only watch as the beings and the robot examined their surroundings, apparently indifferent to the growing terror around them. For what felt like an eternity, the beings roamed the park, seemingly uninterested in the witnesses. Some of the children began to scream, and one girl fainted, unable to cope with the overwhelming fear. But then, as suddenly as they had arrived, the beings turned and re-entered their craft. The metallic door closed behind them with a low hiss, and moments later, the massive UFO lifted off the ground. The craft rose silently into the sky, disappearing in a blink of light that left the witnesses stunned and disoriented. The aftermath of the encounter was immediate. The children were hysterical, running back to their homes and reporting what they had seen to their parents, while some adults were left in a state of disbelief. The local authorities were quickly notified, and within hours, police and reporters arrived at the scene. What they found were more than just terrified witnesses. There were physical traces of the landing, deep impressions in the ground where the craft had touched down, as well as strange, scorched patches of earth, gave the encounter a sense of grim authenticity. News of the incident spread quickly, and within days, the Voronezh UFO landing became a media sensation across the Soviet Union. What made this case particularly remarkable was the number of witnesses. Dozens of children and several adults had seen the craft and the beings. Even in a time when UFO sightings were often dismissed or suppressed by the government, this incident was too large to ignore. For the children who witnessed the landing, the psychological impact was profound. Many of them suffered from nightmares for weeks afterward, unable to shake the image of the towering humanoids and their robotic companion. Some developed a deep anxiety, fearing that the beings might return. Parents reported that their children refused to go back to the park, and many struggled with feelings of isolation, unable to fully convey the terror of what they had seen. The adults, while less prone to nightmares, were equally shaken. Some became obsessed with the incident, scouring the news for any updates, while others, like Boris, questioned their own sanity. The fact that the event was reported by Soviet media, an unusual move, given the country's tight control over information, lent an air of credibility to the case that was hard to dismiss. The Voronezh encounter became a defining moment in Russia's UFO history, sparking widespread debate and fascination with the possibility of extraterrestrial life. It came at a time of political transformation in the Soviet Union, during the era of glasnost, when previously suppressed topics like UFOs were suddenly open for discussion. For many, the incident felt like an omen, a sign that the world was on the verge of dramatic change, both politically and cosmically. To this day, the Voronezh landing remains one of the most well-documented UFO encounters in Russia. The physical evidence, combined with the sheer number of witnesses, continues to intrigue researchers and skeptics alike. While some have tried to dismiss the event as mass hysteria or a hoax, those who were there, like Dmitri and Boris, know the truth. They saw something beyond explanation that day, a terrifying glimpse into the unknown that left its mark on a small Russian city, and on their lives forever. Chapter 5. The Ariel School Incident, Zimbabwe. The sun hung low over the African savanna, casting a golden glow over the countryside as it began to set on September 16, 1994. At Ariel School in the small rural town of Ruwa, Zimbabwe, the children were enjoying their morning break, running and laughing under the vast, cloudless sky. Little did they know, the serene atmosphere would soon give way to an event that would alter their lives forever, a moment that would fill the playground with fear, wonder, and confusion. Suddenly, a strange, high-pitched sound pierced the air, causing many of the children to stop in their tracks. At first, they thought it might be an airplane, but as they looked toward the edge of the schoolyard, what they saw made their hearts race. Hovering just above the tree line in the distance was a silver, saucer-shaped object. It glistened in the sunlight, moving with an eerie, silent grace. Several of the children, most between the ages of 6 and 12, ran toward the fence that bordered the school grounds to get a better view. As they watched, the object seemed to descend slowly, finally coming to rest in the tall grass beyond the trees. The air grew still, as though the very world was holding its breath. Then came the figures. From the craft emerged two small beings, each no more than 3 or 4 feet tall. Their bodies were thin, almost frail, and their skin a pale, chalky gray. But it was their heads, oversized and featureless, save for the 2 enormous, black, almond-shaped eyes that struck terror into the hearts of the children. The beings moved with fluid precision, gliding across the grass, as though they were weightless. The children's shouts and screams filled the air. Some ran toward the school building, terrified beyond reason. Others remained frozen, their eyes wide, as the beings drew nearer. One of the children, a 10-year-old girl named Salma, later recalled how the air around her seemed to vibrate, as if charged with an unseen energy. Her body felt heavy, her limbs unresponsive, as though an invisible force held her in place. And then, something extraordinary happened. The beings didn't speak, but their message was clear, direct, unmistakable, and terrifying. The children would later describe how the beings communicated with them, not through words, but through their minds. It was as though thoughts were planted directly into their heads, messages that bypassed language and went straight to the core of their being. They warned us, Salma would say, her voice trembling in later interviews. They told us we were hurting the earth. They showed me images of forests burning, oceans filled with black oil. They said that if we didn't stop, there would be no future. Other children reported similar experiences. They felt a sense of urgency, a weight of responsibility that they had never known before. Some saw visions of technology spiraling out of control, of environmental devastation on a global scale. It was as if the beings had come to deliver a message not just to the children, but to all of humanity. Change or suffer the consequences. The encounter lasted only a few minutes, though to the children, it felt like an eternity. The beings eventually retreated back to their craft, which lifted silently into the sky and disappeared as quickly as it had arrived. The children, left standing in the field, were overcome with a mixture of emotions, fear, awe, and an unshakable sense of having witnessed something beyond the realm of human understanding. Chaos erupted as the children ran back to the school building, shouting about what they had seen. The teachers, skeptical at first, tried to calm them, but the sheer number of children reporting the same details, 62 students, all telling similar stories of the saucer, the beings, and the telepathic messages, was difficult to dismiss. The headmaster, Colin Mackey, listened with growing concern as the children relayed their accounts. His disbelief soon gave way to a chilling realization. They couldn't all be making this up. The news spread quickly, and soon, word of the sighting reached the local media and beyond. Within days, UFO researchers from around the world had descended on Rua, eager to investigate the extraordinary claims. Among them was Dr. John Mack, a Harvard psychiatrist who had spent years studying people who claimed to have had encounters with extraterrestrial beings. Mack was deeply intrigued by the Ariel School incident, not least because of the clarity and consistency of the children's testimonies. In his interviews with the children, Mack found no signs of deception or fantasy. Their stories were unwavering, told with the kind of sincerity that could not be easily fabricated. The children were visibly shaken, many of them still haunted by the visions they had seen. Salma, in particular, had nightmares for weeks after the encounter, waking in cold sweats, the image of the being's black, soulless eyes burned into her memory. One of the most striking aspects of the incident was how the children's experiences seemed to leave a lasting impact on them, not just in the days following the event, but for years afterward. Many of them, now adults, still recall the encounter with vivid clarity. Some reported feeling a deep connection to the earth, as though the message they had received from the beings had fundamentally altered their understanding of the world and their place in it. Others struggled with the weight of that responsibility, grappling with the question of why they, a group of schoolchildren in a small town in Zimbabwe, had been chosen to receive such a dire warning. As the story spread, the Ariel School incident attracted intense scrutiny, with skeptics and believers alike debating its validity. The idea that a group of children could have fabricated such a detailed and consistent account seemed unlikely to many, especially given their young ages and the emotional intensity of their testimonies. Yet, the incident also raised uncomfortable questions about the nature of human experience and perception. How could such a large group of witnesses share the same vision, the same telepathic message, without any prior influence? Years later, as Salma and her classmates grew into adulthood, they would continue to wrestle with the implications of that day. They had been children, innocents in a world far more complex and dangerous than they had realized. But after that day in Rua, they could never again look at the sky or the earth the same way. Chapter 6. The Colares Island UFO Attack, Brazil. In the remote and sleepy fishing village of Colares, Brazil, the year 1977 would be remembered as a time of unimaginable terror. Located in the northern state of Para, surrounded by the dense Amazon rainforest and the vast Atlantic Ocean, Colares was a place where life moved slowly, until the skies brought a terror that would forever haunt its residents. It began quietly at first, in the late summer months. Strange lights started appearing over the water, glowing orbs that danced in the night sky, flickering in and out of existence as if playing some eerie game of hide-and-seek. Fishermen would come back to shore, pale and trembling, recounting tales of lights following their boats, hovering just above the waterline. The people of Colares had always respected the mysteries of nature, but this was something different, something sinister. As the weeks went on, the lights grew bolder, more frequent, and undeniably menacing. The first attack came in early October. A local man named Jose Cardoso was out tending to his nets when he suddenly felt a strange heat on his skin. Looking up, he was blinded by a beam of light, so intense that it felt like it was burning into his very bones. The light seemed to paralyze him, locking him in place as he screamed for help. When it finally released him, he collapsed to the ground, his skin blistered and raw. He wasn't the only one. Around the same time, a woman named Maria Silva experienced a similar encounter. She was inside her small home, preparing dinner, when the same searing light broke through her window. The beam struck her on the chest, and she collapsed, gasping for breath as her heart raced uncontrollably. Neighbors found her trembling, barely able to speak. She, too, bore the marks of the light, burns and strange puncture wounds on her skin, as if the light had pierced her flesh. The attacks became relentless. Almost every night, the mysterious lights, small, glowing UFOs, would descend upon the village, their beams targeting the people below. The locals soon gave these phenomena a name, Chupa Chupa or Sucker Sucker, because it seemed as though the beams were draining the life out of those they struck. The victims spoke of a feeling of profound weakness, as though the very energy of their bodies was being siphoned away. Some collapsed on the spot, while others developed strange illnesses, skin lesions that wouldn't heal, headaches that lasted for days, and an overwhelming sense of lethargy. Panic spread through Colares like wildfire. People refused to leave their homes after dark, barricading themselves indoors and praying for the nightmare to end. The village, once lively with the sounds of fishermen and children playing on the beach, became eerily quiet as dusk approached. Whole families fled the area, abandoning their homes in search of safety from the terror in the skies. But the lights did not stop, and neither did the deaths. Though many were injured, some of the victims didn't survive their encounters with the Chupa Chupa. A few days after being struck by the light, an elderly man died in his sleep. His body, upon inspection, was covered in unusual marks, as though his very life force had been drained from him. Soon after, another death followed, a young man, no more than 20 years old, who succumbed to mysterious burns and internal damage that doctors could not explain. Word of the attacks quickly spread beyond Colares. The Brazilian Air Force took notice, launching an official investigation under the codename Operação Prado. Military officials were sent to the island to observe the phenomena and gather evidence. What they encountered, however, defied all logic. Their reports, later declassified, documented over 300 sightings of unidentified flying objects during their time in Colares. The Air Force officers themselves claimed to have seen the lights, though they were often powerless to intervene. The villagers, meanwhile, felt utterly abandoned. The presence of the military did little to ease their fears. Many believed the government knew more than it was letting on, and that the authorities were hiding something terrifying. Some suspected that the lights were not extraterrestrial at all, but were part of secret experiments conducted by the military. Others were convinced the lights came from beings far beyond Earth, beings who had no regard for human life. One of the leading investigators, Captain Voronezh Holanda, would later reveal his own chilling experiences during Operação Prado. He claimed that not only had he witnessed the UFOs firsthand, but he had also felt their presence in ways that went beyond the physical. He described a profound sense of unease and terror when in the presence of the lights, as though they were observing him, reading his thoughts, and toying with him in ways he couldn't comprehend. Despite the efforts of the Brazilian military, the source of the Chupa Chupa attacks was never officially explained. The government eventually closed the case, claiming there was no evidence of extraterrestrial involvement. But for the people of Colares, the memories of those terrifying months in 1977 never faded. Many still spoke of the encounters in hushed tones, warning their children to stay indoors after dark, lest the lights return. The psychological toll on the villagers was profound. Many of the survivors developed chronic health issues that persisted long after the attacks had stopped. Weakness, fatigue, and unexplained skin conditions plagued those who had been touched by the light. Some even reported ongoing nightmares, visions of the glowing orbs hovering just outside their windows, waiting to strike again. The fear of the unknown, the lingering dread that the lights could return at any moment, haunted Colares for years. Culturally, the incident left an indelible mark on the region. The legend of the Chupa Chupa became deeply ingrained in the local folklore, passed down from one generation to the next. For many, it was more than just a story. It was a warning, a reminder that the skies above Colares once held a terrifying power. Even today, there are those who refuse to discuss the events openly, afraid that speaking of it might summon the lights back. For the people of Colares, it was no mystery at all. The lights were real, and they had come to their village with a terrifying purpose. Whether extraterrestrial or something else entirely, the events of 1977 left a lasting scar on the community, a scar that would never fully heal, etched into the memories of those who had survived the horrors from the sky. Chapter 7. The Tehran UFO Incident, 1976. The night of September 18th, 1976, began like any other in Tehran. The sprawling metropolis was quiet, with the usual hum of life settling into the backdrop of evening. But what transpired that night would leave an indelible mark on the witnesses, those who looked to the sky and saw something that defied all logic and understanding. It started with a series of frantic calls to the control tower at Mehrabad International Airport. Several civilians had reported strange lights in the sky, hovering just outside the city. The witnesses described the lights as bright, flickering orbs, too large and too steady to be mistaken for stars. Initially, the radar operators dismissed these claims, attributing them to the usual optical illusions caused by atmospheric conditions. However, as more reports came in, it became clear that something unusual was happening. The lights persisted, hovering in place and moving with a precision that defied the patterns of any known aircraft. At approximately 12:30 a.m., Iranian Air Traffic Control contacted the Imperial Iranian Air Force to investigate. Scrambling a fighter jet was no small decision. But when a UFO was detected on the radar, confirmed by both civilian and military installations, there was no choice. Captain Mohammad Reza Astiaji, a seasoned pilot with a reputation for keeping a cool head under pressure, was tasked with the interception. He took off in his F-4 Phantom, its engines roaring through the night as he ascended into the skies above Tehran. As Astiaji approached the location of the UFO, he could see it clearly, a bright, luminous object that seemed to pulse with an inner light, suspended above the city like a glowing sentinel. The closer he got, the more disoriented he became. He had flown countless missions, but nothing in his training could explain what he was witnessing. The object moved at speeds that were incomprehensible, darting from one side of his radar screen to the other in the blink of an eye, yet it made no sound. Astiaji was unnerved, but his instincts as a fighter pilot kicked in. He prepared to engage, locking onto the target and priming his weapons. But in that instant, something terrifying occurred. The entire weapon system on his jet shut down. The lights on his control panel flickered and died. His radio went silent. The F-4, one of the most advanced aircraft of its time, was rendered completely useless, as if an unseen hand had plucked away its technological teeth. Panicking, Astiaji veered away, breaking off his approach and retreating to a safe distance. As he did, the systems in his jet inexplicably powered back on. It was as if the UFO had temporarily disabled them with a precise and deliberate pulse of energy. Astiaji's heart raced. He radioed back to base, barely able to describe what had just happened. His superiors, though skeptical, could hear the fear in his voice. The decision was made to send a second jet, this time piloted by Lieutenant Parias Jafari, another experienced and highly decorated pilot. Jafari's encounter would be no less unsettling. As Jafari approached the UFO, he saw it glowing with even more intensity than before, as if it had become aware of their presence and was demonstrating its superiority. He too attempted to engage, preparing to fire, when, just like with Astiaji, his weapon system was completely disabled. His communications with the ground were cut off, leaving him in a silent, helpless void as the object hovered above him, its brilliant light casting an eerie glow over the cockpit. And then, in an instant, it happened again. The UFO moved with impossible speed, shooting across the sky and positioning itself directly behind Jafari's jet. It was as though the roles had been reversed. The predator had become the prey. Jafari's pulse quickened. His thoughts spiraled into a cold realization. Whatever this object was, it was not only vastly more advanced, but it was also toying with him, demonstrating a control over the skies that no human aircraft could match. Jafari tried to pull away, fearing for his life, but the object continued to follow, matching his every move. For what felt like an eternity, the UFO remained on his tail, a shadow he couldn't shake. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it sped off, darting across the horizon at speeds that defied comprehension, vanishing into the dark expanse of the night. Jafari was shaken, but he managed to return to base, his hands trembling as he landed his jet. Both he and Astiaji were immediately debriefed by military officials. Their accounts were chillingly similar. Two of Iran's most experienced pilots had encountered something in the skies above Tehran that defied all known technology and human capability. Both had been rendered powerless by an unseen force that could disable their aircraft with ease, a force that seemed to operate under its own rules. The incident didn't end with the pilots' reports. On the ground, military radar stations had tracked the UFO's movements, confirming that something extraordinary had occurred. Radar operators described the object moving at phenomenal speeds, making sharp turns that no known aircraft could achieve. These were maneuvers that should have torn any conventional plane apart under the stress. Yet the UFO seemed unaffected by the laws of physics, darting across the sky with impunity. The Imperial Iranian Air Force was at a loss. The debriefings became tense as high-ranking officials grappled with the reality that their most advanced jets had been rendered defenseless against an unknown entity. What was even more unnerving was the knowledge that these events had taken place over a major city, with millions of civilians potentially at risk. Despite extensive investigation, no plausible explanation could be found. The official report on the incident, later classified and shared with U.S. intelligence, described the event in detail but offered no conclusions. For the pilots involved, the psychological impact was immense. Captain Azdiaji and Lieutenant Jafari were both deeply affected by the encounter. Jafari, in particular, struggled with the sense of powerlessness he had experienced, an emotion foreign to a man whose career had been built on mastery of the skies. The weight of what they had encountered left them both questioning not only the capabilities of their own military, but the very nature of human existence. How could they protect their nation when faced with a force so vastly superior and so utterly mysterious? The Tehran UFO incident sent ripples through military and intelligence communities around the world. It was one of the rare cases in which a UFO had been tracked on radar, witnessed by experienced military personnel, and had actively interfered with advanced technology. Internationally, the Tehran UFO incident sent ripples through military and intelligence communities around the world. It was one of the rare cases in which a UFO had been tracked on radar, witnessed by experienced military personnel, and had actively interfered with advanced technology. Internationally, the event attracted attention from both skeptics and believers, with many intelligence agencies, including the United States Air Force, expressing interest in the details of the encounter. Declassified documents would later show that the U.S. Department of Defense took the Tehran incident seriously, considering it a legitimate case that merited further investigation. As with many UFO incidents, official explanations remained elusive. Skeptics pointed to possible technical malfunctions or atmospheric phenomena as explanations for the strange lights and disabled equipment. But these theories failed to satisfy the more chilling implications of the case. For those directly involved, there was no doubt that something extraordinary had happened in the skies over Tehran. As you ponder these chilling encounters with unidentified flying objects, remember that the experiences of those who face the unknown are not just stories. They're a glimpse into the mysteries that may exist all around us. Each sighting leaves you with more questions than answers, challenging your understanding of reality and our place in the universe. Have you ever witnessed something strange in the sky? Or do you have a chilling encounter of your own to share? If so, we want to hear your stories. Don't forget to like and comment below, as your insights might just illuminate the shadows of the unknown. Together, let's explore these eerie mysteries that linger in the night.